Fernando Miguez talk. Fernando is a professor in the agronomy department, and with that, I'll just let him talk. So thanks, Fernando.
Thank you, Gina, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to do yet another one of these online sessions. So, chatting with Gina, we were talking about nonlinear models a while ago, and she said, oh, you should do a presentation for the lunchinators or the agronomists. And I said, well, it's hard to cover all of it in just one lecture. So I don't know why, but I said, let's do it in two. We'll see that. And then I realized two is not enough. It's worth a full semester worth of lectures. But today I'm going to try to give you a few like practical tools and answer some simple questions. So the outline for today is just based on these questions. It's like, why do I mean by a nonlinear model? What options do we have to fit this kind of models? How can we extend nonlinear models? And how can we assess uncertainty? So the first question, what do I mean by a nonlinear model? And in many of you, I think sometimes we take stats classes and you take a regression class, and nonlinear models is that stuff that it's at the end of the chapters of, the last part of the class or the last part of the book, and you don't really get to cover it in a lot of detail, but I think they're pretty useful in our research. So simply today, I'm going to give some examples of, you're looking at some relationship between X and Y, and that relationship is not a straight line, right? Think of it that way simply. And your experiment can be a lot more complicated, maybe it has a lot of variables in it, but perhaps the main interest is in some relationship between X and Y and maybe other variables, but it's not a straight line. It might look like something like what I'm showing here, or maybe it looks something like what I'm showing in this slide. And perhaps, you could even have models with some breakpoints, some features in biology and ecology behave for a certain way, and then after a threshold, the behavior changes dramatically. So what options do we have to fit this kind of models? I'm going to start first with a motivating example. And this is the orange trees. This example is an example of, oranges are delicious, so why not talk about oranges? And in this case, it's pretty classic in at least the plant literature to record the growth of plants over time. So here we have age on the x-axis, and we have circumference of the trees as a way of measuring their growth. Here, this is in centimeters, and this is in days. I'm going to drop units after this to simplify the graphs. So you see that if you try to automate the fitting of this points, you might get a straight line, a simple linear relationship. But we know that it's more of an S shape, right? One option we have are polynomials, right? And polynomials actually fit into the description of a traditional linear model. In a linear model, you have some response Y, X here can be a matrix of several predictors, but the vector of parameters beta enters this kind of relationship in a linear way. Typically, we assume for this type of models that the error has a normal distribution and with zero mean and some variance. And I want to make a quick note here about normality, because in my experience, a lot of times people look at their data and they think, or my data is not normal and maybe I need transformation or I need to do something about it. And many times it's not that their data doesn't conform with the normal distribution. It might be that in reality they have some nonlinear relationship or structure in their data. And that's what it makes it look like it's not normal. But in reality, they have to account for the nonlinearity in the data. And I can say here that transformations are not like generally recommended. I think when you take classes, sometimes they show you how, well, you have some kind of nonlinear relationship, you can transform the data and then go on with your life. Like, of course, there are exceptions. Sometimes transformations are the right choice, but needs to be a careful decision. Just point this out, that sometimes do not confuse lack of normality with nonlinearity. And today there are better alternatives to this simple transformation. So as an illustration, I look at this orange tree data that I just showed you, and I fit a 6-degree polynomial. So you see that this high degree polynomial, 6-degree polynomial, is not performing very well outside the observed data, and the interpolation within data points is somewhat questionable. And you might think, you know, maybe you made this mistake and don't be embarrassed. Like we all do that, this maybe at some point, or maybe you think that, you know, who's going to do this? But I just found this on Twitter. So an Israeli is going around saying that the pandemic is going to end in 70 days. His paper is based on a prediction from a 6-degree polynomial. And he fitted a 6-degree polynomial to some data. And this guy, of course, is appalled by what he was doing. But he's basing his prediction on a polynomial. And that here I can hear everyone laughing. So that's, you know, one of the things that I'm missing from this interaction, but that's intended to be a joke. So let's talk about polynomials before we talk about nonlinear models. Polynomials have the advantage that they're still linear models. They're easy to fit. You just fit a linear model, basically. They're easy to understand sort of mathematically what's happening. But I just show you an example where they're not particularly good at interpolating. They could be a little bit too wiggly. And they can be pretty bad at extrapolating beyond the data that you have. The interpretation, I think this is one of the biggest problems, is that interpretation of those parameters in a 6-degree polynomial is very difficult. Like, how do you interpret the parameter associated with a, you know, a 5th-degree polynomial? The parameters are also unstable. If you think about, well, you collected a small set of data, and if you do that again, if you go and sample another set of data, those parameters might be very different the second time you go and sample. So they're not very stable. And I'm generous when I say that the predictive ability of polynomials is questionable. So this leads us to what I call classic or classical nonlinear models. So compared to the model I'd shown you before, these are examples where the relationship between the parameters and the X or the predictors might not be in a linear way. It doesn't enter as an addition of different things. But we still, at this point, we still assume that the errors have a normal distribution with some variance. So I'm going to give you one example here, just the logistic growth function. So this is an example of a traditional classic nonlinear model where A is some asymptote and the X is our predictor, which in the case of the orange trees was age, and XM is the inflection point. And S here is sometimes called a scale. So I'm going to graphically show you the interpretation of these parameters. So the logistic growth function shows an S-shape type of pattern, and different asymptotes are going to cause a greater or lower, you know, biomass or growth of that plant or animal or subject. Different values in the inflection point are going to move this kind of forward or backward. For that, it was called XM in the previous equation. And the scale controls how spread out this equation is, or the pattern that is forming. If it grows more quickly, then the scale is a lower value. It takes less time to reach that asymptote. If the scale is a bigger value, it takes more time to reach that asymptote. So the advantages is that I'm not going to go into this, but some nonlinear models have like theoretical derivations that make them very appealing. This is one of the big advantages, I think, is parsimony. You can describe sometimes relatively complex relationships with very few parameters. The parameters have a direct interpretation, like in the case of the logistic. And compared to polynomials, as we just saw, they can be better, or they have good properties in terms of interpolation. They can be much better in terms of extrapolation. And the parameters can be a lot more stable. If you go and sample data in different places, the parameters of the non-classic, these nonlinear models can be more stable from one sampling event to another one. A disadvantage is that there are no analytical solutions. So we need starting values and we need iterative numerical approaches to find the solution to classic nonlinear models. It is harder to fit complex nonlinear models, but in reality, it is hard to fit any kind of complex model. And here I have a disadvantage would be that you might be wondering which model to choose. And this is not an easy question, that it's not only based on statistical arguments. I think, in my opinion, you need a lot of subject matter knowledge to decide among competing models. So let's talk about which model to choose, because this is a question that it's not always so easily answered. Here I have this introductory paper that I sent out, which we authored with Didins Arcontulis in the Department of Agronomy. And one of the things we wanted to provide in this introductory paper to nonlinear models was to give you a big table with different equations that you might want to use in different situations. So if you're modeling some of these exponential relationships or sigmoid type of relationships, we have photosynthesis, response to temperature, and several others that we provide here as maybe inspiration to go and find the right model. We also provide this flow chart, and this flow chart doesn't get you to every possible model, but it organizes, if you have not done fitting of nonlinear models, it organizes a few series of steps that you can take to help you find a good model. So for this classic nonlinear models, choosing starting values can be a bit tricky sometimes. It can be a bit of an art. And because of this reason, in the stats package, the base package, you have some what are called self-start functions that start with SS. And some of these models are available, the asymptotic model, by exponential, 4-parameter logistic model, and so on. These are available in the base stats package. These self-starters don't only provide starting values in an automatic way with an algorithm, but they also supply derivatives, which are very useful in terms of the algorithm that finds the parameters. So I'm going to give you a few quick motivating examples, because maybe you're thinking, well, I'm not collecting data on orange trees, on plant growth, so maybe I don't need nonlinear models, but they appear in other settings. This is a classic example in agriculture. Sometimes agronomists want to model the relationship between yield, grain yield, and nitrogen fertilizer, and sometimes they want to model that as a linear plus a plateau relationship. So this is a type of model that has a breakpoint, and that breakpoint can be handled by nonlinear models. As another example here, I have the beta growth function. The equation kind of looks scary, like it has a lot of terms, and you can easily make a mistake if you want to put this equation in R. But it has nice properties, this type of example. For example, here I'm looking at, sometimes we want to look at a process, a biological process, a plant process or soil process or ecological process that has some relationship with temperature. And that relationship with temperature might go up as we reach some kind of optimum temperature for that relationship, and it might go down as it gets too hot for the plants or animals or microbes. The nice thing about using that beta growth function is that it has, in this case, we can fit just 3 parameters to this somewhat complicated relationship, and the parameters have nice interpretations. So for example, they have the peak here, which is W max in the previous equation, the time at which that peak is reached, which would be here the temperature at which we achieve the maximum growth rate, and Tm is the time at which half of that growth rate is attained. This is an example from someone, I believe, working on with something like herbicides and looking at the germination rate of the plants. So as you can see, the 0.9 is a higher value. So you give more of a herbicide and you get less growth. And when you have less, you have a little bit more growth. So if you're studying something and you're looking at the relationship with temperature, chances are that you might want to use a nonlinear model. And another example that appears in those that study soil, it could be, for example, in soil physics applications. And in this case, we have these are typical laboratory examples where we study the relationship between the water content in that soil and the pressure that is applied to that soil. So when you have higher amounts of pressure, this is a laboratory example, you have less water content. And you measure that sort of this S-shaped curve of how the soil releases water as you apply more pressure. In this case, the function we use is a Gardner function, which describes this relationship. And I want to emphasize here that we're not just interested in the relationship between one variable, y, and x, but just in the dynamics, but also how it might be affected by treatments, by different sites, or by different things. But perhaps this XY relationship is what you want to capture first, and then you incorporate the effect of other variables. So I've shown you those 3 examples as to show you that it's not just a nonlinear model is not something you only use when you have something you measure in time, but it could be a dose of a fertilizer in this case, or temperature, or in that case of the saltwater retention curves, the Gardner. So let's go back to our orange trees, the logistic function. And we have this logistic function, and we want to fit it to the orange tree data with age and circumference. The R code that I've used to fit this and the previous one, for the case where we fit a polynomial, as I said, is a linear model. So a polynomial of degree 6, we just say, which you can just put this in here. I want a polynomial of degree 6, and I use age as my predictor, and circumference is my y variable, and they use the LM function in R. The nice thing about this SS functions is that they make it almost as easy, or same as easy, to fit a linear model as you fit a nonlinear model. Here we're using the NLS function, which stands for nonlinear least squares. We just say circumference, the logistic, and we can place names here for our asymptote, their inflection point, are in scale. The nice thing about the SS function is that it supplies starting values automatically to the NLS function, and it supplies derivatives. So that is very helpful in the fitting of the function. So this is what it looks like, our logistic function fitted to the orange trees. When we look at the object that we get from R, in this case, we have estimates for our parameters. There's 192, 728, and 353 are actually parameters that have interpretation. The asymptote is 192 centimeters, at which we think that those orange trees reach their asymptote growth. The X midpoint is the number of days when the half of that maximum growth is attained. And the scale in this case can be interpreted as the number of days between when the X midpoint happens, the 72, and when we achieve about 75% of the maximum growth. So they have interpretation. Because the starting values in this case are so good, the number of iterations until convergence are 0, meaning that the initial values provided by the SS function were practically the ones that already provide you convergence. So I'm going to talk now about the nlraa package, which is nonlinear regression for agricultural applications. One of the things that we provide in the package is an additional 21 self-starting functions. And part of the for me personally, part of the benefit of having these functions is if I'm working with a new data set and I want to say, well, I'm going to try 5 different possible nonlinear relationships, then you might get a little bit lazy if you have to code from scratch 5 different models and try all of them on a new data set. But having these functions means that it's just a matter of seconds to try them out on a new data set. So it makes it reduces the amount of friction. And if you're fitting something like the beta growth function or other functions that have a lot of parameters in them, it's very easy to make mistakes. And sometimes you say, oh, I'm going to do this in 10 minutes. And 45 minutes later, you're still trying to debug and make sure that you put the right parentheses in and the right plus signs and minus signs. So having these functions available provide derivatives, provide starting values, and reduces that friction in terms of trying different models for a given data set. So I gave you some partial answers to what do I mean by a nonlinear model, what options do we have for fitting this nonlinear models, and the next one is how can we extend in part these nonlinear models. So I told you that when I show you this relationship between circumference and age for these orange trees, you might have noticed that as with the linear model, we assume constant variance. And that is actually not a plausible assumption in this case. The variance in the type of relationships that you fit when you're looking at growth usually smaller at lower values, and the variance increases as the x value here increases or the circumference increases. So we would need a model that accounts for that. So I didn't want to have the full notation here, but because it would make things a bit more cluttered. But I thought, well, one option of extending this nonlinear model is to say, as our x increases, as we take different values of x, notice that I put an I here, then maybe we need a different variance for different levels of x. As the age increases and the circumference increases, we need that variance to increase as well. One way of fitting that type of model in R that accounts for that mathematical expression that I just showed is we use now the gnls function, which is in the NLME package. And that allows you to use variance functions. The NLS function in base R has a weights argument, but it's used a little bit different. But here, variance fixed, it means that we can make our variance sort of fixed relationship as a function of age, which is what I just described mathematically in the previous model. If we look at our residuals from this orange tree example, we see that this is before we account for this increasing variance, but this is something that I hope you've seen maybe in statistics classes, that this classic funnel shape. That sometimes you look at your data and you plot your residuals and you see that your residuals are increasing as your fitted values increase. After we fit that model that I just showed you about, the residuals improve a little bit. They're not perfect, but the spread increases, the spread improves. And I should note here that these are standardized residuals. So standardized residuals means that they're residuals divided by the variance at each one of the points. So you want the standardized residuals to be more or less have an even spread across the fitted values. We could also use, we can use this visual assessments of the model, but you can also compare the gnls model with the standard NLS model. And we can look at their AICs and BICs values to compare the both models. And you can see that the gnls model, which accounts for the increasing variance, has a lower AIC and a lower BIC, meaning that according to this criteria, it is a superior model. So we would favor that model over the model that does not account for the fact that the variance is increasing. So we haven't really truly explored the uncertainty in this relationship. So there are a number of options for doing this, and I'm just going to do it in a very sort of partial way to show you some techniques and methods you can use. But since I guess I sign up for next week, we can explore this more deeply if you have specific questions. So one option that we can use is it's called the Bootstrap. And if you haven't used or come across the Bootstrap is a technique where you can sort of resample data similar to the data you've collected and refit the model every time you resample that. So in this case, I have done this, say, 1,000 times. I've like resample using Bootstrap. It's a resampling technique of this model that accounts for the increasing variance. And then I use from those 1,000 resampling events from this same observations, I plotted here the 5% quantile, or the fifth quantile, the 50% quantile, 95% quantile of that relationship. And you see that we get a bit of an increasing amount of uncertainty around the mean relationship between X and Y here, circumference and age. So bootstrapping is one of the things that now you can easily do for nonlinear models, and which is provided in the nlraa package. But in this case, you do have to create a function that describes what kind of feature of the model you're interested in. So here I said prediction function is a function. We use the predict method for X, and X is going to be your nonlinear model that you're fitting. And here I say new data, and I'm creating a data frame that goes from 100 to 1600 to make it a very smooth prediction instead of just as discrete points. And here I'm using system time to time it, but this boot nlme is again a function in this package, and you provide the object that we created with the generalized nonlinear squares. We provide the function that we use for fitting. Here I say I run this, the R is the number of replications. We're resampling 1,000 times. And I run this on my laptop using multi-core and 4 CPUs, so it runs faster. And I think it took like 7 seconds, so it's not a big deal. But with more complex models, it can take several minutes to hours if you have a very complex nonlinear model. So this is an example where I use a different type of function for the variance. It's called a power function instead of the fixed function that I used before. And I'm plotting what does it look like when we use bootstrapping on this function. So you can describe here the uncertainty. And in part, I'm showing this because if you look at the predict method in the base NLS function, it ignores the ability for you to provide confidence bands. So you can't do this with base R NLS. Like it won't provide standard errors for the mean So bootstrapping is one way that you can do this. Another option is nonlinear quantile regression. And with nonlinear quantile regression, we can look at, you notice that this is wider now, but we can do nonlinear regression on the quantiles of our distribution. And in this particular case of the orange tree data set, we don't have enough data maybe to justify doing very fancy quantile regression, but this quantile regression is answering a bit of a different question than the bootstrap method. I'm going to try to explain what that means. So in this slide, you have like two populations, a control and a treatment, and you see that the two distributions overlap to a great extent, right? When I was doing the bootstrap, I was looking at the bootstrap on the mean relationship between X and Y. So that is similar to when we compute confidence intervals, and the confidence intervals are a statement about the mean of those distributions. And you might be interested in the difference between the control and some treatment, and you get a mean difference here. Now there's something called prediction intervals, which are a statement of more about individuals within that distribution. So what I wanted to clarify here is that with Bootstrap, I was looking at how does the relationship between an X and Y and the mean relationship of those orange trees changes when I use a Bootstrap, the uncertainty. And with quantile regression, I'm more looking at the distribution of individuals in that population. And that reminds me, I put a picture of a fish here. When I was a graduate student, a teaching assistant in the stats classes, we had a lot of students that were from fish labs that were studying fish. And you know, when people study fish, they look at individuals, and they often look at the size of the fish. You know, we all know the stories about, you know, do you know the story about the fish is the only animal that grows after it's dead, right? Because the fishermen, like, keep saying that there was a bigger fish, right? When they tell a story about what they caught. But if you can think of, instead of orange trees, you replace this with fish. And a lot of times they're interested in the fact that at a given age, that fish, individuals within that population can have different sizes. So maybe with orange trees, you're interested in individual trees, or you're interested in the average of the population of orange trees. And with fish, it's the same thing. So this, it's like leading me into kind of what I'm planning to cover next time, which are mixed models. So mixed models allow you to both consider processes or features that are happening at the average scale, at the population scale, and at the individual scale. And I put this example of quantile regression because I think in many in the participants today maybe are in the ecology field, and you're actually interested in the distribution of all your individuals in that distribution, and perhaps less in the, you know, what does an average fish look like? Perhaps it's not quite as interesting as what's the distribution of all the fish in my population at a given age level. So some of the things I left out today are GAMs, which are generalized additive models, which I'm planning to talk about next time, and also mixed models, which allow us to think more at the level of population and at the same time think about the level of an individual within that population. So with that, I have the resources that are the nlraa package. It's also on GitHub. That's at my email, and I'll post code which runs, and also slides right after we're done. And I love this meme. Right? Hope you like it too. So now I think I can open it for questions. We have questions available. We'll see how this works. So thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Feel free if anyone has. So go ahead.
I'm sorry, Heldra?
No, go for it. I was just opening the floor. Make sure people knew
Yeah.
that.
Nice presentation. Good summary
Thank
of
you.
nonlinear
Oh, Phil.
regression and of your library. I do have one comment to make, and I'm glad you pointed out the nonlinear or the unequal variance issue, because that's the only justification for transformations, is that you are simultaneously changing the form of the mean function and also the variance function. And sometimes that can be absolutely the right thing.
Yeah.
I know, and this is sort of leading into a question, because although I use var fixed, I'm not an expert in the LME var classes. You specified a formula where age, the variance depended on age, and it looked like it was doing a linear relationship to age. Can you add a factor? So the way you wrote the equation that you wanted to fit, the model you wanted to fit, you had a unique variance for each age. But the code that you actually ran constrained the variances to be connected by a regression-like function of age. And of course, var power changes that regression. Can you put a factor on that into that formula? So age, factor of age, and have it actually fit the model?
I see. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that would be a good approach. I showed that the age one, I showed that one because I thought it was easier to understand, to the fact that you could model the variance as a function of age. You can also change the variance and make it as a function of some categorical variable. A classic one is sometimes you can do it by different species. Maybe different species can have different variances. So you can say, you can put the pipe and then the species. So you can have different variances for different species. Sometimes you can use gender, or male or female can have different variances, and you can model it that way. And you can even create another variable, like an arbitrary variable, and make the variance a function of that other variable that you're constructing. That doesn't have to be necessarily X or Y, if you have like a good way of modeling that. You can also combine different variance functions, in more complicated ways. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I could show an example of that next time.
I think you've got more important things to talk about next time.
Yeah, okay.
Fall into that more important category as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and GAMs are great too. I'm hoping to talk a little bit about that too.
I've wondered what, when it goes from, when you might switch to thinking about using time series versus nonlinear approaches, like at what point are you like, okay, this is multiple cycles, and then you go, then I'm guessing you like, I don't use much of either of those, but in terms of talking, you've asked questions like, when you're like, oh, it's, move past GAM and move to some time series approaches. Do you have thoughts on that difference?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's probably, one of the things I didn't say here is that these classical nonlinear models are somewhat rigid, right? Like you're saying, there's a relationship between X and Y, but they don't have a ton of flexibility. If your data doesn't quite fit that, how do you incorporate flexibility so that it fits a little bit slightly more complex things? That's why I think that's where GAMs can come in. I think they could be very useful in a lot of the things we do, and I was planning to show those examples. The example of quantile regression, you can also, I think the trade-off when you're using GAMs or like non-parametric type of relationships is you lose a little bit that parsimony and interpretability that you have with classical nonlinear regression. I like the logistic example has like the asymptote, the X midpoint, and the scale, and they're very easy to interpret. And I can see if you're thinking about, well, I need to communicate this or write a paper, then you can talk about the asymptote, the inflection point, and the scale, and it's very easy. If you're using a model that's like a non-parametric model or semi-parametric model, or some kind of time series that, you know, oscillates more unpredictably, you don't have the nice interpretation. You're thinking more about that, describing that relationship accurately than gaining an interpretability in the parameters. But I think in science, like we seek that interpretation very much, rather than being so concerned with accurate prediction. In a lot of times when we set up an experiment, you want to understand that experiment rather than, I think in time series, sometimes they're a little bit more concerned with prediction. That's maybe the distinction I would make. And I think one of the things that I would be careful about is that there's some nonlinear functions that can be made more flexible by incorporating more parameters. But what I've seen is that sometimes those extra parameters, they're not well constrained, meaning that when you look at the confidence intervals of those extra parameters that you put in to add more flexibility, the confidence intervals for those parameters are huge. So they're not well constrained by the data. So, but it's a good point. There is a bit of a gray area between the classic nonlinear models and when you start to use a different method that loses interpretability, but maybe gains perhaps prediction power.
Thanks. Any other questions from folks?
Cool. Thank you, Fernando.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, this is Philip again. A comment more than a question.
Okay.
Again, thank you. Remember that quantile regression, at least as I understand it, assumes equal variances across all the observations. Because in the form of the function that's used to fit the quantiles. But I'm very glad you brought up quantile regression, because it is something that is useful in ways that many times people don't realize that such a function could be useful. You're looking for the 5th percentile and the 95th percentile of a distribution of data. Actually, I take that back. I was wrong. It does not assume equal variances. I apologize, but thank you for.
Yeah, there's a paper that's called, it's an introduction of quantile regression for ecologists that I can put up there, which I think it would be useful if anyone is interested. Like, I wanted to point out here that you can have nonlinear regression and you can do quantile regression. And in the paper, they point out that one of the reasons why they like using it is like the example of fish, you know, kind of those type of examples where they're trying to describe the distribution of individuals at different time points, and that quantile regression allows you to have that flexibility, which, you know, one of the perhaps the disadvantages what I showed is the other approach that I was showing is that you're trying to model the variance function, and there's some rigidity there, and quantile regression doesn't have that constraint. But I think it's a good technique for in ecology in particular.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could share that paper or throw it on the Lunchinator on your
page. Yeah, I'll put all this materials up there.
Yeah. One other question is, so again, come from someone who hasn't really used nonlinear models. Do you have to a priori know which ones you think fit the data and then just test like those and a suite of similar ones? Or you were talking about just about like comparing 5 different models. Like, how much of it is, I know the biology, I know what the relationship should be,
Yeah.
I would say, well, it fits it. And how much of it's like, oh, let me compare all these different relationships and see which one fits best.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. I think for the growth models, some of those growth models are derived, as I said, on theory. Like you state your assumptions, and you can say, based on these assumptions, I'm going to derive a model, and that model has a specific form. But I think deciding which model is the best one, I think, is in part a statistical argument to say, well, look, you know, the AIC or residual sums of squares or whatever is better. And part of it is what you are interested in. What are your scientific questions? Because I think some of these models have parameters that are like, yes, I want to know that feature of my data. For example, when I was showing some models have these breakpoints, and the linear plateau model for the response to fertilizer, say that breakpoint is of a lot of interest itself. I mean, we could fit the same model maybe with a quadratic or a polynomial, but that polynomial doesn't give you that breakpoint. But you want to make statements about that breakpoint. So I think it's both. If the data might strongly suggest, based on statistical arguments, that one model is superior. But you can also have arguments that, again, I think this is where subject matter expertise is important, because like we can't rely always on, you know, a statistician. I think it has been trained in a lot of different things, and they can tell, oh, you know, this is a model that fits well, but they might not know enough about the subject matter expertise to understand why what model might be superior to another one. And, you know, and when I work on some of these examples, that we find a lot of examples where we fit nonlinear relationships, and sometimes, you know, it takes me several days to kind of think about which model is better based on our questions. It's not something that I resolve in a couple of minutes or even hours. I fit different models and I think about it, and I reflect, and I try to think about it hard, just like when you think about science in general. So
Yeah.
in my opinion, it's not purely a statistical argument with the comparison among different models. I mean, if one model is clearly the winner, well, you know, the data is telling you something. But if you have like 3 models that fit more or less the same, then you have to base it on other things.
Thanks.
I would concur. I mean, thinking about the biology, the subject matter science, it goes a long way to figuring out what a reasonable model is. I don't know if it's still available. Years ago, and we're talking at least 10 years ago now, there was a standalone software package that would fit something on the order of 1,000 different nonlinear models to the same data set, and then rank them based on usually least squares, or it may have done AIC, I don't remember. And it was, whenever I tried to use it, totally useless, because it would say for a data set where I thought there should be a reasonable, like Fernando's orange trees, it would come back with, and I'm making this up now, a 6-parameter Lorentzian model is the best fitting model. And it's like, no, thank you. Right? As I say, that is the extreme of using the data and not thinking. And I would strongly encourage, especially with nonlinear models, some thinking.
Yeah, I very much agree with everything you said, Philip.
And what Fernando didn't say is this idea that you have interpretable parameters can be used even for models that you might want to fit or could fit in a linear fashion. And my classic example is fitting a quadratic when you're actually interested in the X value where there is the peak or minimum response. We're used to fitting that as just a quadratic polynomial, and then you can estimate the location as a function of those parameters. You can also rewrite that quadratic in terms of, like Fernando had a term for the mean, or the 50% response. You can rewrite the equation where that location of the maximum is one of the parameters in the quadratic, and directly estimate that and get uncertainty and bootstrap it to get, or even use asymptotic expansions to get uncertainty on that estimated maximum. So even things that can be fit otherwise can sometimes be profitably fit by recasting the problem as a nonlinear function of the thing you actually want to know about.
That's cool.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
There is a comment here, or a question. What is this? In the chat.
I think maybe it's just
Oh, okay, okay, yeah.
Yes, don't tell him about that.
Yeah, I'm not a Zoom expert.
I actually have to get running, so I'm going to jump off. But if anyone else has any other questions, Gina, you'll be on there. And
Yeah,
also recording it, and also even send out an email. So if anyone wants a copy of the recording, I can give you access.
Cool. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, again, thank you very much, Fernando.
Thank you, everyone.
And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, shoot me an email if you, anyone.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.
Okay, bye.
Bye.